In most cases, we'll be adding directives to templates that are bound to another controller. This presents an interesting relationship between our directive and that controller, particularly between the scopes of our directives and controllers. In this section, we're going to talk about something called directive link functions, which allow us to pass data back and forth between our controllers and our directives according to their shared scope. In our app.js file, we'll see that we've already initialized our myController, and we're ready to go ahead and add our directive, which we'll do by invoking the angular.directive method, passing in the name of our directive and function definition. We'll add any dependencies that we need for our directive. In this case, we don't have any. And then we'll go ahead and define our directive. And our directive definition tells Angular that this directive should be restricted to elements that invoke the directive using an attribute. We should replace the invoking element, and our template is going to simply be an h1 tag containing that message property from our controller scope. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That our directive has access to our parent controller's scope. And what's more fascinating is that using a link function, we can actually manipulate that parent controller scope. And the way we do that is by defining our link function, which accepts three parameters. The first is scope, the second is LM, and the third is attributes. And the scope refers to the scope, obviously, of the directive, including its parent scope. The LM refers to the element that invokes our directive, and the attributes refers to any attributes included in that element. And so what we're going to do is add two event listeners to our directive. And these event listeners are going to be bound to our element and listen for mouse over and click events. This looks very similar to jQuery, and in fact that's because it is. It's actually called JQLite. It's a light version, it's a condensed version of jQuery that Angular includes by default. So for our mouse over event, we want to make the cursor a pointer, and we do that by simply calling lm.css and making the cursor a pointer. And then when we click on this element, we want to actually change the message by calling the scope.$apply method, which accepts a callback function, and then setting the scope's message property to changed by a directive. So this means that when someone clicks on our directive element, it's going to actually change the message text from hello world to changed by a directive. Let's go to our browser to see this in action. And just as we expected, our message initially says hello world. When we hover over it, it converts to a pointer, and when we click on it, it changes the message to changed by a directive. That's pretty cool how our directive inherits the scope of our parent controller by default. And using a link function, we can interact between those two scopes.